You are next to Thomas. Who is Thomas?
Good afternoon to you all. Warm welcome to this roundtable on building bridges, national development banks in the new global financial architecture. My name is Claire Echalier. I'm a senior project manager for the Institute for Climate Economics, I4CE. And this event has been co-organized by I4CE together with 3 other think tanks, E3G, CPI, and WRI, who are also here with us today. And I think our idea when we started thinking about organizing this side event was to take the opportunity of FIX to focus a little bit more on the role of national development banks in the new global financial architecture, because we know of their incredible role in financing the transition, not only because of the size of the investments they represent, and we've heard a lot about that already over the past couple of days, but also, and maybe more essentially, because of their role in locally shaping the transition. So we planned quite a dynamic session for today. As you can see, there's quite a few speakers around the table, and we're very, very pleased to have them with us today. So we have a panel of esteemed experts from public development banks, representatives from public development banks, but also from the research field in development finance in particular, and climate finance. So I invite you, so we have the names of the speakers up there, but I think because we won't have time to introduce all of them as much as they would deserve us to introduce them, I'll invite you to maybe scan the QR code that's up there, or use the link, because you'll have access through those links to the biographies of the speakers, but also to the different research papers that we're going to be talking about today. So today's roundtable is structured as follows. We're going to have 2 very interesting keynote speakers that will set the scene for us on why. Why are we talking about national development banks today? Why they're so critical players in the new global financial architecture, and why it's imperative for them, for these regional and international financial institutions, to partner with them in the future to better structure the new global financial architecture. Then the discussion will move forward. Will be separated into 3 subsections, which will last approximately 15 minutes each. The first one will shed light on what are we talking about? What is the value added of national development banks in supporting and generating shared global benefits? The second part of the discussion will then explore how do public development banks align with global climate goals, and what this alignment should ideally look like. And then during the third part of the discussion, we'll look more specifically at how national and international development banks can improve their collaborations and work together. So for each of these subsections, we'll have 2 papers that are going to be presented from recent research, and that's going to shed light on some of these questions. And these 2 presentations will be followed by reactions from experts from public development banks who'll share their experience on this field. We'll try to reserve as much time possible at the end of the session for questions and answers from the audience. So I'm going to start by welcoming our 2 esteemed keynotes here today with us. First, I'm going to pass it over to Vice Minister of Finance of Colombia, Mr. Diego Guevara. The floor is yours if you could set the scene a little bit for us, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire, and welcome everyone to our country and this lovely city, Cartagena. Okay, basically I don't want to take so much time, but I want to talk about mainly two important messages. I think that many times national development banks were seen basically many times to try to solve just market failures, but I think toward the new challenge that we are facing in terms of inequality, in terms of climate shocks, I think that they should have a more important role, and I think that there is something that we should address. I think that we should go forward of the maybe some years ago, many people used to see national development banks just for specific sectors, and actually in the standard theory, banks were seen as a passive actors, but I think that today we should understand banks as an active actors, even the national development banks. So I think that taking this idea, we should try to have a collective commitment with this idea and try to see how they're going to try to meet climate goals, but at the same time, social goals. Sometimes we could talk about the green trilemma, as Sebastián Valdecanto used to talk. Here in the emerging economies, we need to face not just energetic transition, also we need to do a social transition and try to resolve the external imbalance sector. So we are facing a green trilemma, and the national banks should be an important actor for this issue. Far from this, for the case of Colombia, we, as told yesterday, we are trying to develop from the national government a joint strategy to have a huge holding with all the different national banks and special financial institutions in order to have, let's say, a long-term financing for different infrastructure projects in terms of to try to solve climate shocks. We have some important institutions as FDN and FINDETER who are playing an important role for specific problems of the country. At the same time, Bancoldex, who is an important partner in this event, and Finagro are also playing a role for the popular economy that is one of the flags of the current Colombian government. I think that far from this, in terms of how they are going to play a role in this idea of new global financial architecture, I think that they should be part for some idea that I talked this morning, and is how we are going to try to associate national development banks with the idea of global public goods or global public goods. When we talk, for example, about Amazonian jungle or the Pacific Ocean, the approach to these goods from the humanity should be from a common good and actually the national development banks should work in the region, and this is the idea of the building bridge, how, for example, the Pacific area national development banks could work together to try to address important issues in the Pacific Ocean, in the Amazonian jungle. Actually, we had an important summit, the Amazonian Summit, 1 month ago in Belém, where all the different countries in the Amazonian jungle are highly committed with this issue. Just to finish and not taking more time, I think that there are another important points and how we are going to try to reform and maybe try to have a new look for the mission of multilateral developed banks. I think that it's going to be something really important, and at the same time, how these national development banks could try to be more inclusive, representatives, and be part of a global financial governance. I think that we should work from the national development banks for an idea of virtuous finance. Unfortunately, in many cases, in many crises, we have faced the scenarios of financialization or the scenarios where finance is not virtuous, it's vicious. So basically, the National Development Bank should have this active role and virtuous role for a development bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guevara, for providing us with this insightful introduction and the example of what's going on for you in Colombia and where the challenges lie. Now I'll turn to Mr. Anderson to get a different perspective. Mr. Anderson Caputo Silva, from Division Chief Connectivity, Markets and Finance from the Inter-American Development Bank, to maybe add to what has just been said on giving the Development Bank's perspective, the International Development Bank's perspective.
No, thank you very much. It is a different perspective, but super aligned what I was just hearing. I wanted to thank everyone for this opportunity to talk here on behalf of the IDB. As we know, in terms of background, after the Paris Summit, a new pact for global financial architecture has emerged. And this new financial architecture, then the discussion we're having here is how relevant the role of public development banks is, no? In their efforts to combine social climate objectives as well as local and public and global public goods. No? And to support these challenges, the public development banks do need to innovate a lot, and as well as to act in a more coordinated way, that as was being mentioned here. And then as we gather here today in this discussion, I was reflecting and trying to see, even though you mentioned about the why and then the what comes later, they are very related. No? And then we thought about 4 areas that I think is critical, that I think would be super important to hear more here. No? Like the first one that we think it's very important in this role is the development of new tools and structures. No? One of the central themes of the workshop is the exploration of innovative financing mechanisms for sustainable development. No? But what is interesting that all the time we talk about innovation, like a lot of the instruments, financial instruments, they're not necessarily new. No? I think that what the big change that we need to see is how we integrate like impact and sustainable development in instruments that already exist. No? So and I think this is the biggest challenge, that where we can have like financially innovative structures with a big impact component, and that's credible, that where the money is going to flow is you're hitting the nail with the, no? Really well. No? So this is number one. Number two, I think that will be very important for us to discuss is the part of collaboration for reshaping the financial landscape. No? Collaboration lies at the heart of reforming the global financial architecture. Today, we will emphasize the significance of forging partnerships between national, international public development banks, shareholders at various levels. So I think that what is very evident in this new financial architecture is the value of combining the different strengths. No? We see this in the role of multilateral development banks teaming up with public development banks. I think that the great example, and then we had a session yesterday, tomorrow we have a working session, is what happened with the Green Coalition that together with BNDES, IDB, and BNDES worked as proponents, but now we have 20 public development banks and multilateral institutions working for the Amazon and joining forces and having an action plan. This is a tremendous example, I think, and the way forward that we should be looking. And just to finish very quickly with the other parts, is that beyond collaboration, financial instruments, I think that related to that is accountability mechanisms, no? That accountability mechanisms being forward-looking mechanisms to influence the future actions, make them more responsive to the sustainable development goal targets. No? So and finally, the last point I would mention is that there are, like we need not to fall in the trap of fragmenting so many different actions, and also in looking also in terms of standardization. Huh? And in the discussions today, we'll delve into the critical importance of aligning the operational strategies of public development banks with both the national long-term strategies and international platforms that champion sustainable development goals. No? So this involves examining current practices and tools, identifying opportunities for collaboration, and then the standardization across multiple institutions. So let me finish here, but I think that these 4 parts are very critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for both of you for setting the scene so nicely. And I think what Mr. Caputo, what you just said, is going to echo, hopefully, in the rest of the discussion on collaboration, the necessity to have tailored approaches and of aligning what we do with climate goals. So I think we can now open the first part of this discussion that you were just mentioning on the what. What is the role of PDBs in financing the transition? And so we've got two papers that are going to be presented there. And the first one, for the first one, I'm going to turn over to Régis Maraudon and Thomas Marois, who are going to present their research work, and hopefully it should come up on the screen.
Okay.
That's right. They're going to present their research work from the paper, which is entitled Multi to National and Back Again, Realizing the SDG Potential of Public Development Banks.
Yes, thank you very much, Claire. We are going to present the paper with two voices, because it's a paper that was jointly produced with Thomas Marois. At the time, the question, and it came out of other editions of the FIX, was to try to see and investigate in a proper research the exact nature and magnitude of the relations between multilateral development bank and national development bank. We heard a lot of it, but we wanted to understand better how is it working and is it aligned with the SDG, in fact, even in the spirit of the cooperation. So we took a sample of multilateral development bank and we simply asked them the questions. So the banks we pick up two banks in Africa, African Development Bank and Trade and Development Bank of East Africa, two banks in Latin America, the CAF, of course, and the IDB, two banks also in Europe, the CEB, Bank of the Council of Europe, and the EIB, and in Asia, the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And we added the Islamic Development Bank for the Middle East. And so, well, the conclusion, I must say, of the study are a bit disappointing, as you can see in the script. I'm sorry for bringing the bad news, but of course there are a lot of nice recommendations to take out of it. But, you know, the reporting is very uneven between the banks. It's very difficult to know, even for themselves, even for their, say, department in charge, to know exactly. They don't have that in the internal reporting system, for instance. So it's very difficult for them to trace exactly what was the activity. Well, certainly the opportunities are there, but they always insist on the multiple barriers that are preventing them of doing more. When you ask the question, I mean, why is it that you don't develop this activity? And the currency mismatch is probably paramount among the various criteria, which depends upon regions also and banks that are being quoted. And lastly, there is really no such thing as a systematic alignment or discussion on tracking the SDG impact on what they're doing. We have little time to present, so all the conclusions, you find them with more details in the published paper, which is available here. And I turn to Thomas to see what type of recommendations can we have for the banks in that respect. Thomas.
Thanks, Régis. And I just want to say we're absolutely visionary in our conclusions and our recommendations, because everybody's been saying basically the same thing for the last day or so. So I'm I'm very happy to hear that. Let me just state the recommendations, and we'll put that as food for thought. One, and again, this has been a topic that I've been hearing over and over in the last day or so, is that the MDBs and national development banks need to co-develop clear, simple, standardized template or set of metrics to track existing financial cooperation. I mean, we've been talking about that in SDGs, but there's little reporting. It was incredibly difficult to find out if there's any relationship between NDBs and the NDBs, which is incredible, actually. Secondly, getting the governing boards on side and the people who own the banks, letting the MDBs and NDBs know that, that their public bank should meaningfully and transparently report on SDG-related financing. So not only on the relation between the banks, but what they're doing in terms of SDGs. Again, absolutely visionary, because everybody's repeating it now. Further, and then the third one, as an academic, we have to throw this in there. Further research is required on to understand the existing barriers to enhance MDB to NDB, so multi-to-national development bank cooperation. And again, lots of discussion and cooperation has been happening here, but we need to sort of pull that question of public collaboration to the forefront if we want to move. This is the point of the report too. If we want to do at the scale, time, and pace needed, and on terms appropriate to green and just transitions, we need that collaboration. And the final one, that's the leaders, regulators, public bankers, and civil society need to start thinking and acting according to a public financial ecosystem approach. So pulling all those resources together systematically, understanding the totality of those resources, and in fact, linking it to questions like public procurement. You pull those together, and we're talking resources in excess of $80 to $90 trillion that can be mobilized as a matter of policy, rather than a matter of profit maximization or something like that, right? We align them, everybody's talking about alignment, but those resources exist. But we need to develop those cooperative relationships and understand them as such. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Régis and Thomas. So again, I think we're going to try and complete this very interesting presentation by looking from a slightly different perspective, or at least looking at one of the things that public development banks can provide, namely local currency loans. And I'm going to pass the floor over to Alfredo Szlachek-Kurucet. I hope I said that right. He's going to take us through the main conclusions of his paper on local currency loans in the global development finance architecture. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. And today I will present a paper we have done with Jiajun Xu from the Peking University. It's local currency loans in the global development finance architecture. And why is this an important question? It's because in order to achieve the SDGs, I think it's fundamental to reduce external debt and currency mismatch in developing countries. With currency mismatch, we mean when a country owes dollars but are financing projects that are domestic oriented. For example, this is very important for the green transition. If you are lending for a solar panels, probably this electricity is not generating US dollars, so you are financing with dollars, but it's a project that is generating local currency. So how can multilateral development banks provide local currency loans? Well, to answer this question, I think it's fundamental to understand how these multilateral development banks are financing themselves. So, for example, if NDBs are financing themselves through issuing USD bonds in the international market, then it's very difficult for them to on-lend in local currency because, of course, there is this currency mismatch and there is a risk of getting downgraded by the credit rating agencies and that will increase their funding costs. So what can we do? In this paper, we propose two solutions. The first solution would be that multilateral development banks are being recapitalized by their owners in US dollars, and they use these US dollars to buy local currency, for example, from the host central bank, and then use this local currency to do on lending to these projects, for example, the solar panel. So this strategy has the advantage that it is providing US dollars to the host country. And this is very important because usually these projects, you have to import inputs and supplies, for example, the solar panels. Another advantage is that because the MDB doesn't have this maturity mismatch, the on-lending can be also longer term. A second strategy could be that MDBs issue local currency bonds in the host country and use those local currency to provide loans. The advantage here is that MDBs are able to leverage because they not only have the capital, but also these borrowed funds. So this means that they can provide more on lending compared to the first strategy. But the disadvantage is that they are not providing US dollars to buy these inputs that are needed. Another disadvantage is that there is the MDB will face a maturity mismatch. So it means that they will provide shorter-term loans compared to the first strategy. Yeah. So, and the maturity of this lending, of course, will be related to the maturity of the bonds that they are issuing. And the third disadvantage is that there is no clear reason why MDBs should be issuing these local currency bonds when national development banks can do that. So, conclusion, it's not an easy question. There are trade-offs. So I think that the best strategy is to acknowledge these difficulties and try to analyze case by case, analyzing the special needs of these countries. For example, a country that has a lot of foreign reserves or has a current account surplus, then this dollar thing, this match, is not important. But if you have a country that doesn't have many reserves, as Argentina is facing situation now, or has a current account deficit, then of course this issue about the US dollars is really, really important. So thank you.
Spot on. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to all three of you for sharing some ideas, some of your ideas, and some of the reasons why you think PDBs have a particularly important role to play in financing the transition, particularly at local level. And I'm sure most of you now would like to hear a little bit about from experts that are implementing these solutions on the ground themselves. And we have here today with us two representatives from public development banks. And I'm going to start with you, Mark Swilling, you're chairman of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And I know you have to leave us before the end of this session. So if any of you maybe have any questions for specifically, maybe we can take them straight away afterwards. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Yeah, in addition to being the chair of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, my day job is as a professor at a university, so I can combine both roles in this discussion. On the paper, or maybe just to preface with a general comment. I mean, what struck me in the last 2 days is the emphasis on the need to mobilize more funds for development on the one hand, and on the other hand, the shortage of bankable projects. So even if we raised more money, would we have the projects? And this conundrum talks to institutional capacity issues. So institutional capacity sits at the heart of both of those issues. And what the first paper is really dealing with is, in essence, to what extent would a partnering or relational approach between a multiplicity of different institutions help to address the question? And what struck me is the difference between the analysis and the recommendation, a huge big gap. So the key recommendation is visionary, which is this whole of public financial ecosystem proposition, which obviously we're all going to sing hallelujah about. But the question is, how does one get there, and what? And I then had to relate that to my own experience, and I'm not sure, in my own experience, that the picture is as pessimistic as you make it out to be. I mean, as Development Bank of Southern Africa, we're involved across Africa, not just in South Africa. And we spend an enormous amount of time at board level and at executive level building these cooperative relationships. So just for example, just a short while ago on the 22nd of August, I chaired a meeting of the BRICS banks. In other words, the DFIs owned by the BRICS countries. It took place in Cape Town ahead of the BRICS summit. It happens every year. And the relationships between those banks is actually really significant, and there are joint projects and so on and so forth. And so the question that arises for future research, now put my professorship hat on, is to what extent is this whole of public financial ecosystem being built from below, so to speak, through the evolution of a multiplicity
of bilateral and multilateral agreements? And what's the substance of those agreements? Is it just nice motherhood and apple pie kind of patting each other on the back kind of associations, or are they real joint projects? And I know for a fact that they are joint projects. So I think that would be an interesting thing. And it's unlikely that there's going to be a great big grand moment when we all agree to build this this global financial system. So it has to get built, you know. And how is that happening? On the local currency discussion, I mean, that's a big issue for the BRICS banks and the BRICS. As you know, there's even suggestion of a BRICS currency, which is pretty unlikely because you need a BRICS central bank for that. So the kind of fallback position is local currency funding. And this is a really useful contribution to thinking about the very practical details. And just to refer to one precedent, the New Development Bank has issued a bond denominated in South African rands. And you know, so that's a very good example of what you are talking about in the second option. But the challenge that we're going to face in the African context is how we work with other African countries where there's very weak and volatile currencies. So that's one of our big challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think maybe we can pass it over directly to Murtaza Sayed, and then if there are any reactions after that, we can take them. You're head of ecosystem in the economic department of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I think you also wanted to share some reflections on the two presentations we've just had.
Thanks very much, Claire, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I'll take a slightly different tack, I think, from Mark, certainly on the first paper, the one looking at relationship between NDBs and public development banks. I represent a multilateral development bank that's the youngest multilateral development bank. AIB's only been around for 7 years now. And what I have found is that while we do have relationships with public development banks at AIB, for example, in Brazil, we just funded $100 million worth of renewable projects through a public development bank. The relationship is not very systematic. And in fact, this was something that was also a key finding of the eminent persons group that was working on G20 reforms and reforms of the international monetary system, that the relationship between NDBs and public development banks is kind of sketchy. It needs to be made more coordinated. There needs to be a joint effort. You know, the challenges that we have right now, both on development and the energy side, are such that we do need collaborations, and there needs to be a much more sort of joint effort to do this. The first thing to do, of course, is to figure out what constitutes a public development bank. And even that, yesterday we found was a very good paper done by Peking University and AFD. Even defining what a public development bank is a little bit challenging. But it makes a lot of sense to collaborate, I think. I think we need to work together. There needs to be some things that I think public development banks need to do to make it easier for multilateral development banks to engage with them. First of all, their mandates are not very clear sometimes, and it's not very easy for multilateral development banks to know which public development banks to collaborate with. Secondly, their governance sometimes has issues. It's not clear how independent they are, transparency issues around their financial statements. So unless those things happen, it becomes difficult for multilateral development banks to work with public development banks. And one thing that I would like to suggest is actually country platforms. These have been used in a few countries. For example, even here in Colombia, there's the 4G program on toll roads, where the government has brought together its different development partners, and they have agreed to a common set of standards around ESG, around reporting, transparency. And that makes it much easier then for collaboration to happen. So maybe one idea that we can take away is to have more of these country platforms applied in different places. I only have 30 seconds, but on the local currency paper, I found that very interesting. It's obviously an issue that's been around for a long time. Original sin is something that, you know, emerging markets and developing countries have been trying to get rid of for a long time. But it is a very important issue, particularly now when debt is very high and you have all these needs for climate financing. So it's very important to try to get more local currency into the system. I think your proposals are very interesting, but they all rely on a recapitalization of multilateral development banks. And whether there's appetite for that right now, given what's happening geopolitically, we'll have to see. But these are interesting proposals. I just wanted to say that at the AIIB, we are looking at a different approach to this issue, together with the IGC, the LSE, Oxford International Growth Center, as well as the EBRD and hopefully ADB and IMF as well, which is to have a sort of a two-pronged approach. One is to try to build local capacity, local financial markets in emerging markets. And the secondly is to have some sort of platform, either onshore or offshore, that can then transact with these countries and take away some of the currency risk. This could be TCX, it could be Frontclear. So we have a different kind of proposal, which I'm happy to get into in the discussion. But I find your proposals quite interesting, but they would rely, I think, on a recapitalization of MDBs, which is kind of a difficult thing to coordinate around right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Syed. I think we now have a better understanding of what the role of PDBs may look like and why this discussion is so important. What I suggest, I hope the organisers won't mind, is maybe we take 5 minutes now to take some questions on the first papers, because I know, Mark, that you're going to have to leave us afterwards, and then we can take that time off the questions and answers at the end of the session. I don't know if there are any questions at this stage, or if the researchers want to react to what's been said by the operationer. Yes.
Of that is very high. So it makes the cost of the lending very, very high. So the alternative is to try to manage that risk by looking at the correlations across currencies. And it turns out that if you have a diversified portfolio of currencies, the correlations are actually not that high, especially when you bring in a lot of countries, and that you can better manage the risk through diversification. And so the alternative idea is to think, which is what TCX, the idea behind TCX, is to have a diversified portfolio, and then how do you manage that across the banks and across the MDBs? Because a national country, so how do you, some sort of reinsurance or platform is necessary to bring in the risks from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, to have as a diversified portfolio as possible. So just to note that this other idea that's been around forever, we wrote a paper about this back in the early 2000s on this idea of diversification and using how do you manage currency risk rather than trying to hedge it every single time.
Thank you very much. I don't know if that calls for a reaction maybe from you, Alfredo, or if
yeah, so thank you for all the comments. No, I mean, of course, it's that's why I said this is a very difficult question. And of course, if we are going to do it, there must be this recap. Even this TCX, I talked to, for example, people from the BNDES, and they were telling me that, yeah, but it's too expensive. So, I mean, with this, I don't want to put aside any option. What I'm just saying that we should understand the limits, and then in a case-by-case way try to see. And also the idea of Shari, I now in the new version of this paper we'll have 3 options, not 2, and we'll have it. And I think it is a really interesting idea. I would just add that one of the problems that I find with that option is that when the country has to pay back this loan, even it means that even if the loan is in local currency, the MDB will have to exchange that local currency for US dollars. So it is putting a problem to the host country. So, conclusion, there is no perfect solution, and we should consider all these options and try in a case-by-case see, okay, what is the best in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo, for responding to those remarks. I think on the other part of the discussion, we also have Thomas or Regis who wants to respond to, I believe, Mark's remarks.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, just very quickly, and thank you both for your comments. I think because you both kind of pulled out the tension in the paper. One is that there are sketchy relationship and it's not very systematic. And second, it probably is happening bottom up, but we don't know, which is part of the recommendation. It was incredibly difficult to discover any sort of relationships between NDBs and the national banks because they're not reporting on it. And so we would love to see more of that. And I think for this paper, what I would like to do, Reggie, is maybe next year to go back and ask the exact same questions and see, because this was done last summer, if there's been movement in them. And yeah, aspirational, of course. We got to do things better.
Thank you very much. And I see between you, the row of speakers here, that we have another question from the audience there.
Hi. So I'm from one of the NDBs, that's SIDBI in India. Thanks so much for all the sort of great ideas. And one thought was really about how to remove currency risk entirely. Now, that's such a nice question to ask. However, you know, sort of aspirational it might be, but the question really is that, can we even think of some sort of a guarantee program that could be wrapped around this whole concept of currency risk? Because somebody has to hold the currency risk. So, you know, typically we guys do it when we borrow from the multilats. But, you know, even if one were to put the shoe on the other foot, it would, you know, finally that balance sheet is written in US dollars. So, you know, this is really the point, that can we shift this out of the balance sheet, take it as a below the balance sheet item, a contingent liability, and then put a guarantee program around it. I mean, this is something which we've just been sort of thinking about, and we've even bounced it off World Bank. But I think this, you know, august audience here has the power to take these ideas forward better. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Does anyone want to respond to this suggestion of installing a guarantee program for currency risk? Yes, Alfredo, please.
Yeah, I think it's also quite interesting. The only question is who is going to give these guarantees? If it's the host country, then I think it's a bad idea. If it's the MDBs or the rich owners, then I think it could be a good idea. I mean, we are looking for the SDGs, no? So I think we should agree that it's the developing countries cannot take that risk.
Thank you. I think the message has been well taken. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any other questions, but otherwise I probably suggest that we move on to the next part of the discussion, the second part on alignment of PDBs and how we can maximize the impact of public development banks, especially at national level. And to start the conversation on this, I'm going to invite Aki Kashi from the New Climate Institute to shed some light on the recommendations and conclusions and recommendations that come out of his paper on supporting financial institutions in developing countries in their alignment journey with climate goals.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, this is a study that I carried out with Alice Potier from I4CE, which actually builds on some previous work that we had done on providing input or some ideas on an MDB approach to Paris alignment for their intermediated loans and activities, which we had conducted with WRI and German Watch. And it came from the realization that in order to have a real impact on Paris alignment, it's not enough to only look at the use of proceeds and say, okay, this is Paris aligned, that is Paris aligned. We need to move to a counterparty level and say, okay, is my counterparty aligned? And if my counterparty is not aligned, I am not aligned. And in order to ultimately, and we've just heard about the amount of time and effort spent on developing relationship between banks. Ultimately, in order to be completely Paris aligned, a bank needs to realize that they need to engage with their counterparties to bring them along their alignment journey. So essentially, we need to move away from that project-by-project approach to a counterparty approach, and eventually actually move up to a more systemic, holistic approach, looking at the financial system in the counterparty's country on a broader level. And this is something that is very important, not only given the diversity of financial instruments and the diversity of activities of different MDBs, but also the speed with which we actually need to be mobilizing capital in order to reach the Paris goals. And so we looked at this, and this doesn't only apply to NDBs, MDBs, NDBs, and private, but also to private financial institutions. It's really almost any counterparty. But we propose that one place to start is that we need a common assessment framework. It's not enough that the European Investment Bank and maybe the AfD and the KfW have an assessment framework for a counterparty. It's much better if we actually come together among MDBs on their Paris alignment journey and say, okay, we have a common assessment framework for counterparties in general, and agree with that, with a harmonized approach, with using both qualitative and quantitative criteria, and develop kind of a tailored engagement approach for counterparties to help them along with that journey. And that is something that needs to be systematic. And it's not going to be the same for every counterparty. It's going to be different for different counterparties in different countries. It's not enough to only do this with carrots. We also need to do it with, or not enough to do it with sticks. We also need to do it with carrots and provide real incentives in order to move along that Paris alignment journey. And at the same time, it's not enough to be providing sticks and carrots, but also technical assistance needs to be mobilized in capacity building. And really, that should also be done in a harmonized manner in order to avoid a duplication of efforts between MDBs. And of course, counterparties are going to be working with many different MDBs in many cases, and as well as national development banks. But moving from sort of the bottom of the slide towards the top of the slide, it's still not enough to think about counterparties, but we also need to consider the context in which they are active. And so on a broader level, MDBs and other national and public development banks need to also step up and scale up their engagement with governments and help governments provide and develop the proper regulatory framework in not only defining what a low greenhouse gas climate resilient development pathway is for that country, but also on the regulatory and supervisory level of financial markets in that country to foster transparency of the data, to develop a climate-focused engagement and capacity-building strategy, not only for the counterparty, but also for the regulators of that counterparty and the counterparties of the counterparty. And so, essentially, I think it's very important, and I'm very happy that I've been able to observe the evolution of the thinking especially among the MDBs. That we have moved along and involved quite a bit from a case-by-case use of proceeds, project-by-project approach towards a more holistic counterparty approach. But we need to move one step further and really move to shift the entire financial system. Yeah, happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aki. But before we answer any questions, I think we can pass it over straight away to the person sitting next to you there, Valerie Laxton from WRI, who's going to present the results of your work on what an ideal development and climate MDB would look like.
Great, thank you, Claire, and thanks for having me on the panel. So the recent calls for MDB reform have generated a multiplicity of ideas, and we've heard many already today in the past 2 days. They're largely focused on scaling up the amount of funding available, but adding more funding to the system isn't the only answer. And MDBs have to evolve both in the work they do and the way they operate to meet both the climate finance and the development finance needs. So in joint work with CGD, the Center for Global Development, we asked what the ideal climate and development bank could look like. But instead of thinking about a totally new institution, rather we want to build upon the existing core capabilities of the multilateral development banks with the view of creating the synergies and this ecosystem approach. And we dug into fundamental ways in which an ideal MDB would differ from the existing institutions. And we focused on aligning priorities with the global climate goals and the sustainable development goals. We also focused on working together as a coherent system that includes multiple stakeholders, very broad approach, and on focusing, and then we focused on deepening and scaling partnerships, notably with other development partners such as PDPs. And on the screen, this is really just a snapshot of the reflections from the paper, which is quite long. And I'll emphasize just the first aspect. It seems to have some few typos. I don't know why it turns out that way. Sorry about that. But
I think it's the R's that are weird.
The first aspect is MDBs support countries in formulating and financing their strategies for low carbon and resilient development path, because a central question for us was how are investment priorities set? So it's a little bit the idea of country-level platforms, etc. So we suggest that countries should chart their own low-carbon, climate-resilient development and growth paths with robust analytical support from MDBs. Such analytical support would integrate really the climate and development challenges and help countries set priorities for investments, interventions, and policies. And I'm well aware that not all the development banks are equal, and many don't have the resources to carry out in-depth research in all the issues pertaining to such a remit that would be very broad. Though some development banks do have large analytical capabilities, and we've seen the example of the World Bank publishing climate and development reports most recently. So this type of integrated analysis could inform other development partners, and there could be shared data, shared models, shared scenario analysis to support Paris outcomes and SDG targets, attaining them. And the wealth of local knowledge that has been accumulated through the multilateral level, but also national development banks, that could be integrated, such as climate risk assessments, the very local knowledge could be shared across the ecosystem of PDBs. So what strikes me here when listening to other panels has been that I repeatedly heard that development banks don't have enough resources and capacity to do all of it, while relying more on each other, on other partners in the ecosystem could help already with that data collection, that knowledge sharing, and it would also support coherence in the system, backing one country-owned strategy and that integrates climate and development rather than public development banks individually creating their own separate country strategies, etc. So it would be more consistent and help achieve their parts in the Paris goals and the SDGs. And we also propose going beyond that, going deep rather than broad, by prioritizing interventions or investments in sectors that are critical for development and climate. And those climate and development outcomes could be combined rather than spreading financing thin across projects. And that prioritization could be country-specific, could include focusing on specific sectors, or other priorities such as building resilience infrastructure, housing, or specific natural capital. And success would be defined and measured not by financial inputs, but by a number of prioritized development and climate outcomes. And of course, concessional finance to support climate-related objectives in particular can be an essential contributor to this success, depending on countries' circumstances. And sources of concessional climate finance could then be consolidated, and it would help avoid the current fragmentation and spreading thin. So I view the financial system as an architecture made of different nodes, and each part has different comparative advantages and business models and incentive structures, and working more as a system that seeks to reach specific outcomes that combine climate and development would involve that stronger partnership, transparent and candid exchange between partners and stakeholders and governments, and notably with a view to increase investment in preparedness and resilience that remain consistently underfunded. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for summarizing the results of this very interesting paper. And now to react to both these to the results that were presented in both these papers, I'm delighted to have a high-level representative from CAF, Carolina España, you're Executive Vice President of CAF. If you'd like to take a few minutes to maybe react to what has just been said, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for the presentations. I would start by saying that we do have a very important opportunity to take leadership in the role as MDBs coordinating the support for mainstreaming all climate and also SDGs implementation in public development banks. I know that many, at least in Latin America, are starting to do that. We have to work maybe in a more systematic way, and I really like your proposal of developing like a methodology to work to make this more, I would say, more formal procedure and more standardized and also more sustainable. So that's something that I think it's going to be it's going to be a game changer for the region. And you know, Latin America, it's a region where you have countries, very different countries at different levels. But in general, I think there are many countries that do have banks, public development banks, that are, you know, taking the lead on these themes and in this implementation. So that's one reaction to that market. And I think that the two-level working, the two-level of proposed by you, working with the authorities, but then also working at the local level with the financial institutions. It's a must. We must encourage public policy, and we must help our governments to make a more directed regulations, so we can accomplish our development goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement. But also we must help our local institutions to implement these systems, as we were just saying. So that's one comment. And the other comment regarding the way of how to define success, how to encourage more those local systems to be more committed to the agenda, the 2030 agenda, and the climate alignment. I think I would say there are two things. One, I think maybe we can use the measuring the results according to the national objectives is one of the main, I guess, main challenges that we need to face. Is not easy. We know that working in a multilateral development bank, that's something, you know, that is not easy. But at CAF we have done, last year we launched our strategy, our 2026 strategy, and we have a set of cross-cutting agendas which are very important and which cover all our sectors. And one of the most important, because we want to be the green bank of Latin America, but we also want to be the bank that promotes sustainable development in Latin America. So those are our two pillars. And one of the cross-cutting agendas that we have is to have greener operations. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting reaction, Carolina. Maybe in the interest of time, we can move to the last section, and then we'll take all the questions at the end. So to conclude this discussion, we wanted to talk a little bit more about how public development banks could collaborate, and you sort of already touched on that a little bit, better and more broadly with national development banks, NDBs and national development banks, sorry. So to feed the discussion, I'm going to pass the floor over to Elise, who's sitting right next to me, Elise Dufier from EDRI, who's going to take us through the results of your paper on enhancing coordination between European donors, development agencies, and DFIs and PDBs.
Thanks very much, Claire. Can you? Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. So today I'm sharing the lessons from a European think tank group study, which basically is a collection of 8 case studies on cooperation between European DFIs and PDBs. I will focus here on 3 lessons, which I applied to the case study I worked on France. So which involves some organizations that you've heard of a number of times since yesterday, and some colleagues around the table can also jump in if you want to add a few comments, since it involves the AFD, Proparco, 2 ministries, so Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Finance, as well as the European Commission. So the case study was built around a specific project called FISEA, which is a facility for long-term investment and job creation in Africa. But basically what I want to highlight here is, the topic of the discussion is around building bridges around between actors. So I mentioned the AFD and Proparco, but also the involvement of 2 ministries in the European Commission. The first lesson I want to focus on is upfront coordination at the programming and designing level. So there's one element that was highlighted in all the case studies, is the fact that as part of the European Union programming exercise, there was something called the Team Europe approach, which basically involved pre-programming coordination between actors who wanted to access finance from the European Commission. And that was highlighted as an interesting example of an initiative that led international cooperation between French services before going to the European Commission and making a joint proposal. So it's an example of concrete collaboration where they had to identify the specific contribution, look at sort of added value of each institution and their respective strengths, to speak with one voice as friends in the European Union. Which involves clarifying roles and responsibilities. So in that specific case, the AFD group led the negotiation with the European Commission, also speaking on behalf of Proparco, which didn't have a representative in Brussels at the time. So I'm focusing here at the European environment. And what that meant as well is that it helped looking into combining different types of skills, and also bringing private and public expertise, so creating a dynamic linking not only various levels of operations, so national, European, for international intervention, but also thinking of the types of institutions and instruments involved. The second lesson I want to highlight here is actually something that was mentioned in other presentations as well, is thinking about development impacts and sort of development-oriented objectives. And it's something that was highlighted in the evaluation that was conducted as part of this project as well. So I mentioned that the variety of actors involved in the first place was identified as an asset to combine different types of expertise, but it's also sometimes a challenge when you have to design sort of shared objectives and thinking in terms of long-term strategies. And that made it more difficult, more fragmented, especially around different understanding of what development impact meant. And that was specifically important for that project, given that the focus was on implementing more risky operations in African countries. So the development impact understandings varied from more qualitative and quantitative ones, thinking about policy dialogues. The global strategy changed 3 times as well in less than 10 years. So that meant that was difficult for beneficiaries to identify where they could actually access funding and where they could implement some of those projects and reaching the geographies in need, adapting specific instruments as well. For actors involved, in order to reach compromise and share a methodology, we talked about global framework earlier. That was one of the points made in that evaluation as well. And for example, at the implementation, when monitoring the projects, not all the actors are based in country either, so that can make it a bit more difficult. And also to bring other actors, there is a need for shared understanding and more long-term strategy and objectives to bring other people on board, including when we talk about leveraging the private sector. So that was the second lesson, to sort of build a more shared long-term and more development-oriented oriented objectives with clear indicators and impact to lead transition in countries and avoid some of the challenges mentioned. And the last lesson I want to share here is that donors do not need to lead the cooperation. So that specific project led to the creation of a facility with its dedicated governance structure, and that was identified as a key asset because it lets space for discussion and involved all stakeholders, but also included specific experts and specific expertise depending on the needs, which sort of facilitated also the involvement of national counterparts at different stages of the project. And I'll stop here, thanks.
Thank you, Elise, for explaining a little bit the reasons why it's so important for PDBs to collaborate and the underlying issues there. I'll pass it over now to Laura Sabogal from E3G, who's going to take us through what shapes paths to Paris alignment among NDBs and what are the implications for MDB, NDB on lending. And that's a paper that I think is it's not been released yet. So you can tell us maybe just when that will be released as an introduction as well. Thank you.
Building on the very interesting research that was already presented here from Regis and Thomas, we realized that increasingly banks are under pressure and the ecosystem is under pressure to deliver the goals of the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, and this whole ecosystem approach, it is quite important, no? For the reasons that we know. There are comparative advantages. The NDBs they're closer to the ground. They understand the needs of the country. They can help prepare the pipeline. So all of that things that all of my colleagues already mentioned, right? So we wanted to have a better understanding about how the paths to Paris alignment were having an impact on climate on lending, but also how the relationships between MDBs and NDBs were working. And I think somebody here said, I think it was Alfredo, whether there's actually good relationships happening or is it really just, just for the picture, right? So we're really trying to understand what is the quality, what makes this on lending be as effective as possible. So starting from these observations, that there is little available data on MDB, NDB, climate on lending, and that the data, there's variation between institutions and instruments. That's already a patchy start. And also knowing that there's different paths and progress towards Paris alignment because, of course, MDBs and NDBs, they have different institutional settings, they have different mandates, they have different shareholders, different priorities, and most importantly, they also operate in different contexts. So that's also something to note. We came up with a hypothesis, and that hypothesis is that there are common influencing factors and interplaying dynamics across these two areas. And we actually want to understand through this research what are those in order to come up with some specific recommendations as to how to mitigate them. I think what is really interesting is that a lot of the colleagues here have mentioned some of the things that we are looking at. No? So in terms of the factors, we are looking, for example, at mandate and how does mandate have an impact. also the political economy of the shareholder structure, right? When you are an NDB and you have one sole shareholder, it's absolutely different than when you're a multilateral bank and then you have to balance that, all that out, right? And then, of course, the institutional capacity, which was also mentioned, which I think sometimes is overlooked. We always think about policies and structures, but at the end of the day, it's human beings operationalizing this and making sense of all of it. And we know that there's urgency, and we know there's a lot of pledges going on. CAF recently made public its pledge, the IDFC members, and so on. So with all of that in mind, we have been conducting this study, which has entailed data scraping to understand the climate on lending relationship, but also relying on the assessment that we do from the different banks through a tool that E3G has, which is the Public Banks Climate Tracker Matrix. We have come to some preliminary conclusions, and the reason why it's preliminary, it's because we are keen to hear from you and to keep consulting in order to see whether we're on a good track. And so these preliminary findings and recommendations is that, first of all, it's really important to have, and this is also something that Tomas and Regis were mentioning, no? like better understanding of what are those financial interactions, better disclosure in order to understand what is working and what is not. That is an absolute precondition. The second one being that it's always very important to recognize the local macroeconomic context and how they have an impact on NDB operations and their ability to effectively use climate finance. Like every bank is operating under a context, and we cannot pretend that they're existing in a vacuum. No? So how do we go about that? And then same applies for the MDBs. No? For MDBs that are not currently doing so, they should provide more local currency loans or provide other financial mechanisms to help address issues of sovereign debt. So again, like the flexibility between these relationships so that they can complement each other. And then finally, and this is of course something very interesting because I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but it always comes up. It's like the transfer of knowledge across the ecosystem. Banks that are already going through that process need to convene and go to other banks, share those lessons learned, those success factors. And I think a good example of that is the IDB and ALIDE and the technical working group that you have jointly structured to help members of ALIDE with their Paris-aligned methodology. I think that is a prime example of something that should keep happening, no? Sharing knowledge. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for sharing the preliminary results of your current research. And now I'm delighted to invite Thomas Melogno from AFT to react to both the papers that have just been presented by Elise and Laura. Thomas, you're the Executive Director of the Innovation and Research Department at AFT.
Let me react quickly. No, actually, I will react to almost all of the papers that we've heard before. A few months back, economist and Nobel Prize winner Robert Lucas passed away. And if you had the chance to read his paper, Why Doesn't Capital Flow from Rich to Poor Countries? Actually, you can reread it, and if you didn't, you can read it for the first time because the article lays out a number of theoretical reasons why capital doesn't flow from rich to poor countries. It was written in 1990, but a number of things we're discussing today were actually identified at the time. And if you look at the current macroeconomic situation, you could say that capital still doesn't really flow from rich to poor countries, in particular in hard international currencies. So just look at the interest rates in developing countries these days, whether in dollars, whether in euros. Not only are they expensive, but the spread with developed countries remains quite high. And one of the reasons, I mean, there are reasons like asymmetry of information, but still the fact that money doesn't really trickle down from MDBs and in general developed countries to developing countries. countries. And why is it an issue? Because we have so many things to finance, and the transition is not necessarily, environmental transition is not necessarily bankable. So if you don't have capital at relatively low rates, there are many things that you are never going to finance. So it was discussed or said that there are not necessarily projects to be funded, bankable projects, but there are also things that need to be funded and are not bankable. So that's one important point. So between MDBs and NDBs, one important thing is who's best at doing what. And certainly, I need to go quickly, but MDBs are good at emitting big bonds in dollars, in euros, maybe in renminbis, not necessarily in local currencies because of management cost. So that's, I think, one important factor. However, NDBs might be good at emitting bonds in local currency. So that relates mostly to Alfredo's first proposition, which I think has more advantage than the second one. Another thing is that we discussed being aligned, but I always ask the questions, aligned with what? Actually, very few countries and that includes France, have a well-designed, crafted and detailed trajectory towards net zero or even towards the SDGs. So cooperating on establishing these trajectories also is something that I think MDBs and NDBs can cooperate. Why so? Just to give you an example, AFD, we have been coupling many climate models with macro models, and doing that 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and so on, certainly is an advantage relative to doing just once in your country, because very few people are actually doing it, and we observe a massive shortage of HR in that particular field. So I see many issues for cooperation, but again, it's important to know why the system is failing at providing capital and sometimes policy from MDBs to NDBs, and exactly identify the fields in which either MDBs or international development banks and national development banks comes with a particular advantage, because they don't necessarily have the same. And while I agree on the fact that cooperation is good per se and is a way to tackle fragmentation, crafting a coherent design and knowing exactly where to cooperate, I think is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So I think this was the last reaction we had, and before I pass it over for the concluding remarks, I mean, we started a little bit late, so I think we still have 5 minutes maybe to take a few questions, especially maybe on the two second parts of the discussions that we had on the how to align maybe and how to better collaborate. I don't know if there are there any questions from the audience, and or if you want to interact with one another. I have one. Yes, please.
The first question is a little bit broader, but the title of the panel is about national development banks and global financial architecture, and certainly one public good is climate stability, but another public good is financial stability. And national development banks play a very important counter-cyclical role, much more so than regional development banks or multilateral development banks, and I've heard very little about this, so I would like some reactions on this. That's number one. And number two, I just wanted to, this is a question for Thomas and Regis on their paper. The paper seems to be about lending, and I browsed through your paper, and there's a paragraph on support by technical capacity. And technical capacity is really important, and I didn't see anything, but I just browsed through, so I may be wrong, about, for example, multilateral banks acting as guarantors, let's say, of an issue of a bond by a national development bank or a regional development bank. That's one question. And the other question is the chain of causality. It seems for Latin America, it goes from IDB to CAF, and then from CAF, sub-regional development banks, to national development banks. But if one looks sometimes at the corporation, it's a little bit more complicated. It's not a linear causality. Sometimes CAF does interact and contribute actually to IDB's development of certain projects because they have more knowledge of specific countries. Thank you.
Yes, I think I'm being told that we're going to have to leave the room soon. Sorry. So sorry. You're going to have to leave us soon. So maybe if someone maybe can respond to this question very very briefly, and then I'll pass it over to you for the concluding remarks. You summarize. Well, in that case, we can conclude, and maybe you can speak. Yeah, maybe you can continue the discussion afterwards. Sorry, I wasn't aware that you needed to leave. That's fine. Thank you. So yes, I'm delighted to pass.
Thank you for your patience and your comprehension. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to the organizers, you and all these people, for the invitation to give the closing remarks and these building bridges to the NDBs in the global financial architecture. We have heard really interesting studies and reports from distinguished panelists and speakers. The research presented shows the importance of this and is the beginning to unpack how we can improve this coordination and also ask for actions. And a lot of actions has been asked in these papers. I will take the liberty to highlight some of short ideas and also briefly share what we in ALIDE we are doing in this regard. Without any doubt, there are obstacles to finance a coherent ecosystem and also multiple obstacles to grant loans to NDBs, as well as difference between regions, countries, and the process of alignment with the Paris Agreement. One of these obstacles is the currency exchange risk we've talked about. And to face it, interesting formulas have been presented, and they must be analyzed in depth. I personally believe that the solution goes through the capital market that Mark mentioned. In the past, the MDBs could issue in local markets, and this will force a lot of, and the country must have a lot of commitments to support the capital markets on this, but it is something that we must talk for hours and hours. There's also, it's important the collaborative and coordinated action among the various actors related to the financial field, including the state, is fundamental, considering it as a central topic of discussion of the global financial architecture, as well as to have more public information regarding the key issues for approval of projects that you have mentioned in the papers, and greater collaboration and capacity building between MDBs and NDBs in climate-related issues and governability. We heard in the opening plenary how FIX has brought together public finance institutions to the same table, and it's great. It's really great. And how is the time to operationalize this community of MDBs and NDBs working together more efficiently to maximize complementary, and it's therefore a core priority given the scale and pace in which we need to deliver. Considering the momentum of recognition of development banks around the world, we have experienced all the problems that we have passed through the different crises. But we think that it's time that the NDBs deserve to have more space in major international organizations and summits where issues of global relevance of sustainable development are discussed. They must be the relevant channels for the funds from international organizations. The global green funds should regard on NDBs as the main allies to channel the funds they have. Regarding the action of ALIDE, as you were mentioned, we have been working with our regional financial organization to significantly expand the action of NDBs to become really greener and aligned with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. To that effect, together with the IDB, with our friends from IDB, in the framework of COP27, we created a working group of alignment to the Paris Agreement for public banking as a collaborative and interactive space that allows members to know what the Paris Agreement implies and what's the add value, because the Paris Agreement, but what is the add value that it gives to my organization? How can they work with the mandate? How to integrate this commitment into the strategies and operations and design a roadmap that guides them into building their own business model to travel this path, looking to achieve a virtuous cycle of learning translated into attaining results. Also, at the Financing Common of 2022, we launched the group of development banking and SDGs. Furthermore, we're very committed to supporting the Latin American and Caribbean Carbon Market Initiative that it's being promoted and directed by CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, which seeks to promote the global competitiveness of and supply of carbon credits generated in the regions. Another thing I want to mention is that we have talked about the relationship between MDBs and NDBs. And based on my personal experience as a former banker and a former commercial banker and development bankers, I agree with Mark from the Development Bank from South Africa. What we mentioned. One key issue I see is the lack of sustainable green projects to be financed. If we don't have these green projects, we will have problems. And this is a problem that we have to deal with. In Alide, we try to build capacities to our members through different courses. But personally, I think that it's time that a pre-inversion area where projects are structured is a need. And this is something we have talked in different meetings with other friends, and it is something that we will need. If you only let the market that provide you with the projects, this is one way, but this is probably not the best way you have. I let you with this idea, and I also want to invite you to our Chief Economist Roundtable, where Chief Economists from World Federation, one of the FIX organizers, an organization that gathers regional associations from Africa, Asia, Islamic countries, Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean, will deal with development banking challenges in an uncertain environment. And we, with Regis, we are going to be there with some of you. Thank you a lot, and thank you for your patience. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Edgardo Alvarez Chavez. I realize I didn't have time to introduce you, for providing the concluding remarks and for summarizing so well the discussions. And I'm very excited to know that many of you will be pursuing these discussions after this session. So thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank you to the audience for this very interesting discussion today. And we'll see you soon.